The trend with modern music productions has been to record countless tracks, resulting in a session of sometimes upwards of 150 to 200 audio tracks. Well, today I want to tell you a few reasons why you should consider recording less tracks and some of the benefits you'll gain with this approach. Back in the days of traditional analog recording, there generally were some limitations with, the number of tracks that you had at your disposal on recording consoles. Back in the very early days of recording, it was simply 1 or 2 tracks, and then as consoles developed over the years, it became 4 tracks were an option, then 8, then 16, 24, 48, and so on. When we've arrived at the point today where we pretty much have unlimited tracks available in modern digital audio workstations. So today I really wanted to talk about why, in my opinion, less is more, more often than not when it comes to recording. Whether you've hired out a big professional studio with a producer and engineers, or whether you're at home recording in your home studio or on your laptop, there's a big argument for the fact that time is going to be a real challenge for all involved. The more time you're spending recording means the less time you have to record more music and to be more creative and stay inspired. The more time you invest in a song, the more of a risk it's going to be to lose that inspiration. And that's quite often how people end up with hundreds and hundreds of incomplete demos or partially finished songs, because there's been far too much time and thought and overthinking involved in the process. Time is also money when you're in a professional recording facility, so you really need to be as efficient as possible, and that's where being very decisive about the number of tracks you choose and how many you plan to record becomes a huge factor. The music industry has arrived at a point where more frequent releases are a bit of a trend at the moment, whether that be singles or EPs or short releases of just a couple of songs. If you're going to compete with the level of artists that are being super efficient and getting more material out there, you're going to have to really look closely and refine your own recording techniques that's going to allow you to reach those targets. So generally speaking, the less time you invest in recording dozens and dozens of the same track and the same instrument over and over, the more chance you've got of being able to complete the recording and move on to the next one. Recording large numbers and sometimes unnecessary numbers of individual instruments and vocal tracks and other audio tracks, what it does is it creates an unnecessarily complex production session. The more complexity you create with the number of tracks that you have, arguably the more complex the subsequent stages of the production are going to be as well. So if you're employing a mix engineer to work on your project, that's going to become a complicated process potentially as well, because the mix engineer is going to have to learn the intricacies of all of those potentially hundreds of tracks, and that's going to further delay the process. And then if you do get to the mastering stage, that can potentially be somewhat complex as well, depending on how you've arrived at that point. And once again, the less complicated your session can be, and that you can even refine that right down to how you actually record each individual instrument. Do you really need 6 microphones on that guitar cab? Or do you really need 4 microphones in front of the vocalist? Does it really need to go into a complex array of different preamps and compressors? And can you get a similar result by simplifying that recording chain effectively? Moving on from the complexity of the recording itself, you're then going to run into the challenge of the frequency, masking and overlap between individual instruments and recordings. Now bear in mind, you've only got a certain amount of the frequency domain to use up when you're producing and recording music. So you need to think carefully about which instrument or recording is going to occupy each individual spectrum. If you've got 5 different kick drums in your recording and they're all pretty much operating in that same 50 hertz region, for example, you're going to have some real problems in trying to get them to fit in. And quite often the more masking and the more overlap you have, the more headroom you use up, which means you're then overloading your mix bus or your master bus. So it creates a wide range of a bit of a domino effect as you keep trying to add more tracks on top of each other, and then you're trying to continually find room for everything. There are a number of modern artists out there that swear by a very simplistic approach. A great example is Pharrell. He's done a number of very famous worldwide smash hit recordings that have come together with very few tracks. One song in particular was a song called Happy. Now that was put together with really a fairly simple percussive arrangement and some vocals and not much else. The final point that I wanted to make, and it's a fairly straightforward, self-explanatory one, but the less tracks that you have in your recording, the less problems you're potentially going to create for yourself. Now, I must say, I'm not suggesting that you should do away with large chunks of your recording and try to have a minimalist approach. I mean, there's a time and a place for having a lot of tracks, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you should completely disband that idea altogether. I think you should really have a think about in the pre-production phase before you actually start recording. Have a think about what you're trying to achieve and how can you best achieve that by keeping things as simple as you possibly can. One of my favourite quotes is an old quote from the late, great Tom Petty. And he said back in I think it was in the 70s or the 80s, that if you can't do it in 16, you can't do it at all. What he meant by that is if you couldn't achieve your result with your song with the 16 available tracks that they were on the consoles back then, you can't do it at all. Certainly it's food for thought given the plethora of options we have in modern recording. I guess sometimes we're like a kid in a candy store nowadays. We have unlimited options, and sometimes that's not always a good thing. So have a real good think about what's going to work best for you, and I'm sure your recordings will be much better as a result. Well, I hope that's given you a helpful overview of how recording less audio tracks in your music productions can have a wide range of benefits. Certainly for any further information, or if you're looking for other articles about music production and hints and tips, check out my website, mnproductions.com.au, and I look forward to catching you again soon.